Chapter 8. When the king sleeps, the queen closes her eyes. As a knight-at-arms, when he is about to fight, dons his doughty armour and musters all his strength, so Reynard, facing the greatest danger that had ever threatened him from any side, raised his head, clenched his teeth, and, with a slight upward movement of his lips, gaily trimmed his whiskers. That was how the animals who were still assembled at Breviand saw him appear. It was almost noon. The storm, which had rumbled round the valley for several days, was now driving over the treetops enormous clouds swollen into monstrous shapes, dark blue in the centre and light or copper-coloured at the edges. An overwhelming torpor weighed heavily on all the creatures, burning up the gorges with its oppressive heat and making the leaves motionless and silent. The only sound was the buzzing of the winged insects, green flies jumping incessantly, irritating ticks with avid pincers which made the animals shudder, lash their tails and growl. But a loud murmur passed from one to another, swelling out more than the clouds in the sky with their load of hail and thunder. Scattered forms rose one by one among the bracken, the coppices and the flat rocks. Snorter, Bamber, Besant, Bruin the bear, still covered with black blood stains, Tibbet, coiled round a curving branch. They were all there, drowsy and feverish, each one of them pursuing his solitary and savage dreams. Their eyes red or sticky, their coats dry or steaming with sweat, they stood up, quivering, catching a well-known scent in the air. Suddenly they caught sight of Reynard, and immediately they went into a trance, lowing, braying, bleating, snorting, growling and hissing, pawing the ground, biting tree stumps, clawing the bark, digging up the soil and the dry leaves with their horns, antlers and snouts, kicking up their back legs like dogs over their victims or over dirt. "Reynard! Reynard!" The little birds too gave way to the madness. Wings fluttered in the branches, wings as tawny and blue as the storm cloud, wisps of black and white smoke uncurling in the gaps between the thick leaves. Jays, crows, fierce magpies with beaks like stilettos, sparrows, ragged blue tits, cackling partridges with scarlet caps, all of them screaming and shrieking, mourning the death of their brother Turcelin and their companion the rook, of Redbeak and Pincher, and of Tinker's baby sparrow who fell into the grass among the berries, the loss of so many goslings who had bled to death, of the capons, hens and succulent eggs that had been gobbled up, crunched to pieces and engulfed in the fox's stomach. "Reynard! Reynard!" All the creeping beasts, the little killers, the furtive and jealous ones, Chaser the marten, the polecat, the stoat, the weasel, they were all there, crossing each other's paths in the grass, hissing like the red asp as they glided towards the fox. "Murderer! Let Ysgrim draw his blood!" The noise grew louder and louder. Backs were arched, muscles quivered, jaws opened wide, breathing became panting. Ursa the she-wolf awoke. She trembled for her dear friend, yet admired his daring, and prayed within her heart either that Ysgrim would remain asleep, or that he would die as soon as he awoke from the apoplectic fit that threatened him. The wolf was there, lolling in the grass, his coat rough and his tongue hanging a foot out of his mouth. How red his tongue was, edged with foam as it lay between his teeth. They were long teeth, as broad as whetstones, pointed and sharp with rounded humps in them, long rows of teeth fitting against each other, made to bite, tear and crush. Oh, Reynard's legs would seem so delicate if they were seized in such a vice. His thighs were muscular, but so slender beneath his red coat. Ysgrim's shoulders quivered, his nostrils fluttered. He stood up at once, his eyes blazing coldly, a howl gurgling in his throat before he had realised what was happening. When he stood up, the great wolf was terrifying. He leapt to his feet with a single bound and looked questioningly round him, his jaws hanging open, brigand and strangler that he was, killer without feeling or pity. Reynard saw him and assumed that he was already lost. He thought of Ermelin, their sons, and the inviolate earth where he had left them, and he thought more tenderly of their little rover who had embarked so valiantly on the harsh and bloody adventure into which his father had dragged him. Ah, Reynard, you chose it. You told yourself that this was the last time. May Reynard's stars prevent it in fact from being so. This time Ysgrim's howl was a true song of death. His withers bristled, his eyes blazed with lightning fiercer than that which flickered through the distant undergrowth. He leapt forward, but stopped suddenly, digging his claws into the ground, for on the edge of the rocky terrace, King Noble, half opening one eye, without condescending to roar even once, had stretched out his powerful paw in a movement so smooth and sure that it was barely perceptible. He drew in his claws, and with velvet fingers took hold of the fox beneath his body and lifted him up, as lightly as though he were a feather, bringing him close to him on the rock. Only then did he condescend to speak. "Let us sleep," he said. "The storm is at last coming to a head. Let it break out now. The rain will relax our nerves." Having said this, he closed his eyes again and went to sleep once more. Reynard was still amazed, and risked a wary look round. The bare rock, tawny-coloured like the lion's skin, was as hot as an oven. In the background, two enormous blocks of stone, their summits leaning against each other, outlined the doorway to the cave where the lion cub and the lioness were no doubt sleeping. Instinctively, Reynard went up to this dark opening. He had already made up his mind. He would pretend to sleep, while taking good care not to do so. He stretched out, his chin resting on his paws, the stone burning his stomach. His keenest, most subtle and fox-like looks filtered through two imperceptible slits. He kept one eye on Noble's enormous head, and another on the black entrance door to the den. This was a strange truce, laden with unknown dangers, which imposed a more terrible strain on his nerves than dispute or combat. The thunder rumbled, still in the distance. A faint rustling began to run through the leaves, but it was only a breath of wind, and it died away at once. Below, too, all was silence, but this very silence was threatening. Reynard shuddered, and started moving from one side to the other. What was happening now? The silence was suddenly broken, and tragic, discordant cries rang out. "Mercy! Justice! For our wife, our sister, our cousin, for the excellent lady, our round and plump Chippet! Your Majesty! Everyone! Revenge!" It was Chanticleer, the old sultan, the young blackie with his comb at half-mast, and the hens, Pinty, who laid so well, Russet, Brownie and Whitey, weeping and moaning. Poor things, they were so far from their secure farmyard. Where had hatred of the fox led them, and what of the rumour that he was doomed, that Ysgrim, by the grace of King Noble, was going to challenge him, fight him, and kill him? The noise woke the lion. He was furious, and called out in a grating voice. "What's the matter now?" The cocks and hens, pushed up by the crowd below, perched on the edge of the terrace. "It's a cock, your Majesty!" said Reynard, leaping at Chanticleer's throat. Blood began to flow. A cry of fury arose and spread like wildfire. Noble smelt the blood, stretched out his paw, extended two claws, and with one stroke removed the young cock, the four hens, and even Chanticleer from Reynard's nose. "What's the matter?" he repeated, half asleep again already. "Another cock, your Majesty," said Reynard, "and 4 careless hens who fell under your paw." Good," said Noble. And he went to sleep again. The thunder rumbled and came closer. Brief gusts of wind, becoming more and more frequent, lifted the leaves and turned over their pale undersides. Reynard pretended to be asleep, but he had never been more wide awake. Gradually his astonishment subsided. He realised that the king was king, that he spent his life like this, but that he proposed to arrange it as he wished. That was why the cocks and hens were slowly bleeding to death on the stone within reach of the terrible paw. But through understanding this, Reynard felt himself become all the more Reynard, more subtle, more bold, and more determined than ever to live. He should have been trembling with fright, yet on the contrary, his blood felt lighter and ran through his veins like flashes of saltpetre. He had the courage to crawl to the edge of the terrace, and watched a russet will-o'-the-wisp running from Snorter to Bamber, from bleated to the hideous bruin, gliding through the grass, slipping from tree to tree, finally circling round the rocks of Breviand and climbing, invisible now, from stone to stone, up to the summit. When would his gallant son Rover reach the Gastel rock, of which the summit, high in the sky, overhung King Noble's terrace? Reynard, still lying like a sleeping beast, half opened one eye from time to time and looked at the frowning summit. Finally, he caught sight of the tiny shape he was looking for, and sighed with relief, although he shuddered at the growling thunder. The night was dark, and long mauve flashes of lightning streaked across it. During a moment's silence, he distinguished another sound of growling, as soft as the purring of an enormous cat. It came from the dark cavern of shadow behind him. He went closer, his heart beating, and felt another enormous velvety paw, which caressed him, rolling him along, turning him over, drawing him closer. And he gave way, sank down, and abandoned himself into this vast warmth, the lap of Lady Proud, the Queen.